Welcome to the Customary Land podcast. I'm your host, Spike Boydell. The Customary Land podcast is about all things relating to the equitable management of customary land. In this episode, I want to talk about my relationship with leaseholds and their importance, as I see it, to customary land. It's a story that starts in my early career and ends up in discovering some problems with leases in the Pacific. But actually the story is much longer and I think more interesting than that, in as much as it's going to talk of a shipwreck in historic Australian situation that resulted in what I see as something of a train wreck for leases or long leases in New South Wales and thus, as part of a history, in the Pacific. So let's start with my early career. I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Urban Estate Management in 1980, and my first job was working for Liverpool City Estates Surveyors Department, who were the, for want of a better word, the custodians or stewards of land that had been dedicated during the Victorian era to development of an industrial city, in that case Liverpool. So when I talk of leases in the UK context, and long leases as we're going to be talking about, these relate to those residential development leases which were established during the Victorian era. Now, thinking about that same Victorian era, that's the time when countries were being explored, for want of a better word, colonized, ceded in the Pacific to Queen Victoria. So there's a connection that I want to make all the way through in this episode, and that's that we had these development leases. They were in Birmingham, they were in central London, they were in a number of cities in the UK, and they were seen as a way to enable land to be acquired relatively cheaply, and then people would build a house on it, or a developer might build a group, or an investor might build a group of houses and then sell off those houses. But what they were selling was a long leasehold interest. Think about 99 years, that sort of time scale. And these had been granted during the Victorian era, including the latter part. So if you think about me starting my career in 1980 in Liverpool, those leases were at what we called then the fag end of a lease, towards the end of the lease structure, which means it was time to contemplate doing something with those leases. Generally speaking, the leases had been granted with either a premium at the outset or just at a ground rent through the period of the lease. So sometimes a premium and what we would call a peppercorn, a next to nothing, a notional next to nothing payment, or a regularized ground rent. But these ground rents were relatively modest. Sometimes they had reviews and were increased, but often we found ourselves in a situation where the ground rents would be less than £100, certainly, and quite often significantly less than £100. And they say that it could be as low as a peppercorn if there had been a premium granted at the start of a lease to put a larger sum of money forward. There was a problem with them in the UK, don't get me wrong, because sure, it let the UK cities develop very effectively. People had access to land who couldn't afford to buy a freehold interest. They built a property on the land, but the leases were very explicit. Where it gets interesting is that those leases were very well crafted. It allowed people to get access to land inexpensively to either build a property or acquire a property that had been built by a developer without the expense or the fragmentation to the overall structure of a city. It's all retained by what were known then in Liverpool as the city fathers, so that the leases would allow people to build, develop inexpensively, because they weren't paying upfront for the cost of the land. But it was on the proviso, this is very important, and I'll return to this, that at the end of lease, at lease expiry, lease expiration, that the land and any approved improvements thereon, in other words, they were building leases and people had to, as a condition of them, put a property, a house, within certain specifications on the land within 3 or 5 years of the granting of the lease. So the land and the improvements thereon had to be returned in good and tenantable repair at lease expiration. So this really wasn't a problem for the people when the leases were granted, because you enter into an agreement where there's an obligation to do something in 99 years' time. Well, it's not going to be in your lifetime. It's not really going to happen on your shift, so you don't necessarily worry about it. However, these properties are sold because you can sell the rights. So you're not selling a freehold, you're not selling superior interest in customary land, you're selling the leasehold rights, because often those the conditions of the leases were that they could be transferred between parties with the approval of the landlord. And so down the track, a couple of generations later, there were leases which were becoming increasingly shorter. Now, that created a problem in the UK, very significant, and I'll get to that in a minute. It's what I ended up dealing with. There's an important aspect to this, though, that I discovered later wasn't really incorporated in the thinking either in Australia or the Pacific. When we, I say we, myself as a valuer, wearing my valuer's hat, valued leasehold property, we used what was called a dual rate approach. So we looked at a remunerative return from the investment. We also incorporated a sinking fund with an accumulative rate. So we had what might be, 5 or 7% for the remunerative rate, but we always included within the calculations, in those days we weren't using computers, we were using Parry's valuation tables. And those valuation tables published all the relevant formula that the valuation profession used, all the relevant calculations, should I say, for a term of years of an investment when you were calculating it. So if you're looking at leaseholds, they differed financially from freeholds, because freeholds would be single rate, and that would be considered a slightly more secure investment, so a slightly lower yield, as we called it. And for leaseholds, slightly riskier possibly, because of what I'm going to get to in a second, but we would have that remunerative rate and then a much lower accumulative sinking fund rate. What was that sinking fund for? What was the thinking behind that? Well, critically, it was about making sure that at lease expiry, that sinking fund at 2.5% or 3% had accumulated very securely and safely over the years, so that there would be an amount at the end of a lease to enable the purchase of an alternative property, as in alternative improvements, or for compensation for those improvements. Let's fast forward to 1980, from the start of these leases during the Victorian era. And we find ourselves with a situation that I inherited, that these leases are in their last 5, 10 or 15 years. And we're talking about thousands of properties across those, or many thousands of properties, should I say, across areas of cities like Liverpool, Birmingham, Bristol, London. And that created an issue because as we get towards the end of a lease, the value starts to tail off. Because if you try and sell something that only has 10 years left to run, and you're responsible for making sure that it is returned to the landlord in good and tenantable repair at the end of that 10 years, the amount you'd be prepared to pay for it is quite different to say you had 75 years left to run. So leases were considered something of a wasting asset. And as such, the value started to diminish. Having said that, in the 1980s, my father was living in London, and he bought a lease with something like 12 years left to run. He knew he wasn't going to be using that property because he was commuting every week down to London. And he just had a very small apartment that he paid an amount for. And I believe when he sold it for just as much, because people still needed access to properties in the inner city, and there was a lot of competition for them. Plus, there is the prospect that you can possibly renew your lease because the landlord doesn't want to occupy your property. So you can release the property, but you tend to pay for the improvements, because on the new lease, the improvements actually belong to the landlord, the freehold owner in the English system. And as I sort of expected when I started working in the Pacific in the late 90s, I also assumed that the properties would return in good and tenantable repair to the customary landowners, because the lease was leases were predominantly in the Pacific on customary land that was outside of reserved land. So there was this sense in cities which were not as financially as illustrious as London, and here I'm talking Liverpool, Birmingham and others, that in the last 10, particularly 5 years of those leases, people didn't maintain them. These are old properties by this stage. These are 90, 95-year-old city properties. And certain of them were in areas that had once been more valuable, but had gone into inner city decline. Indeed, these leases were partly to blame for that inner city decline as people moved out to the suburbs, had more space, had a garden, and also in many cases might have bought freehold land or not, quite often leasehold land in the suburbs as well. But with a longer lease, because they may have been developed in the 1920s, the 1950s, and people would have then thought 99 years, this was 1980, whoa, we've still got 60 or 70 years to run, what's the issue? So the leases that I inherited in my job were those that were approaching expiration. What we did in city estates, we had a building surveying department. The building surveyors would go out, and you might have been in this property this property might be, should I say, 95 years old. 95 years old, they're going to have a hard-worn roof. They're going to have rising damp, possibly. They're going to have deteriorated window frames and doors. They might need painting. And they could indeed have dry rot, circular lacrimen impacting but due to historically poor damp-proof membranes and damp-proof courses, they could have deteriorating timber in the structure. So our building surveying department, which I spent a little time in, would go out and prepare a schedule of repair or a schedule of dilapidations to present to the tenants. Now, think about it. These are the tenants who are living in an older, inner urban property quite often, sometimes decayed in terms of the physical structure, and may not have the money or wherewithal to easily be able to undertake those improvements. But it was their liability under the terms of the lease because they were the current tenants. So that was quite a shock for a lot of people. And it wasn't a situation that only started in the 1970s. There was leasehold reform legislation, Leasehold Reform Act of 1967 particularly, was put in place to help politically address this urban decay. That enabled people who were on long leases at low ground rent, who had been in occupation for the requisite number of years, to do what was called enfranchising. So they could either seek to acquire higher interest if that was possible and available. So in some cases, people did acquire, in the UK system, the freehold interest. So this leasehold enfranchisement legislation had created a structure that enabled us to, as I say, grant long leases, and it allowed some people to, or new long leases, it allowed some people to acquire the property in that structure and receive a discount for the fact they'd been in for a long period of time. So indeed, for my own professional qualifications to become a chartered surveyor, I had to do a specialist report, like a sort of mini master's type thing. And my focus at that stage for my test of professional competence was a particular leasehold reform set of cases and all the legislation relating to it, because that was one of the major projects that I was dealing with. It wasn't an unknown problem. It became complicated in the UK because if there was piecemeal acquisition of those, of a higher interest, a freehold interest, of those properties which were now 100 years old, and only a few people had bought them in a street, and the rest were in very dilapidated condition, it led a potential to a fragmentation of that estate managed hitherto in its entirety by what was colloquially known, in fact probably was not just colloquially, but it was actually known as the City Fathers, which was very gendered, but then again it was from the Victorian era. There was another angle to this, which I won't get into in this episode, which also was the 1980 right to buy legislation, which allowed people in a similar situation, not on such long leases, but who'd been in occupation of state or council-owned property, were actually able to acquire a superior interest in their council house and buy a property at a discount, again leading to fragmentation of estates, which was critical if some of these wider estates were in a state of larger dilapidation and required by the state for whole-scale demolition and clearing and rebuilding. So there's a slight distraction, but in 1993 I found myself in Australia at the University of Queensland, and I was teaching some mature age part-time students. Racked up to the first lecture with all my UK-based law, understanding that much of the law here in Australia was based on those same legal structures. No. I went from a situation of these 99-year residential leases, a situation where we also had what were called institutional leases, which related to retail office and industrial properties. And those institutional leases, called institutional leases because they were appealing for institutional investors, so insurance companies, superannuation funds, trusts and the like, they granted normally 21 or 25-year leases. The 25-year leases had 5-year, often upward-only rent reviews, and the 7-year leases, the 21-year leases had 7-yearly upward-only rent reviews. And when I was in private practice at a later stage, before I came to Australia, one of the things I would often be doing is negotiating those rent reviews, and was a very significant value created for tenants between the length of those reviews, because over 7 years with inflation, someone might be sitting as a tenant on significant value in terms of profit rent. Say you were paying, I don't know, £20,000 a year, but the market rent was now £30,000 a year for a commercial asset. There was a £10,000 a year profit rent between now, if that was the assumed full rental value now, you might still have 3 years before your next review. So you were accumulating a value. So you could sell your lease with a premium, and that was common practice. I also got involved in agricultural landlord and tenant structures, and also tenant right valuations on lease expiry, which was more complicated. I'm not going to dwell on that one, although I will talk about agricultural leases a little bit in a moment. So, ended up in Australia. Suddenly I was dealing with 2+2 or 3+3 year leases. 6-year leases. What good was that to an institution? Where was the value of a tenant's interest? But here in Australia, as I soon discovered, tenants have very few rights, and the value of their interest is very small because of a short time scale between reviews on commercial properties, shops, offices, industrial. And importantly, I believe that we also had the situation where turnover rents and overage rents came into play in the retail sector, which is an area which I specialised in for my PhD. And that was, again, very problematic because all the power was placed in the hands of the landlords, the big shopping centre magnates in that case, for those turnover rents. So Australia, I discovered, had this quite different leasing structure. Then, 1998, I moved to the University of the South Pacific. I get involved in, obviously, all things related to land in the Pacific, which means, in the 12-member countries in particular of University of the South Pacific, which means I'm dealing with not the Crown and freehold as the highest level of interest, but the highest level of ownership, or the highest level of property right you have in Pacific nations, of course, is with Indigenous land. And as I've alluded to in other episodes, the perhaps more developed structure of hierarchy of leasing out land had been achieved in Fiji because of the establishment of the Native Land Trust Board in 1940 to actually lease out land, non-reserve land that wasn't required by the customary landowners at a village level. I also walked into the melee that was occurring at that time of the expiration of the Agricultural Landlord and Tenant Act leases and some of the Native Land Trust Act leases that applied to a critical part of economic stability in Fiji, and that's the and those Agricultural Landlord and Tenant Act leases Alter and Nalter, the Native Land Trust Act leases, were put in place for the sugarcane industry. So many of those leases in Fiji, from the agricultural point of view, 60-year leases, or in some cases 75 in others, had been put in place 60 or 75 years early. A lot of them were about to expire, or had indeed just expired, and they hadn't been dealt with by a succession of governments post-independence. Because one of the things, it's great to grant leases because they allow development. The challenge, I'm not going to call it a problem because I don't think it is, the challenge is managing, and it's not even complex, it's just a bit complicated sometimes, but really it isn't that complicated even. The challenge is managing those leases in the years as they approach lease expiration to ensure that people who want to use the land commercially productively have the ability to do so. The owners of the land have the opportunity for intergenerational equity because the land isn't taken from them, it continues into the future. And there's a level of harmony. First up, I've got to say, in all societies, there are those who have the higher interest in the land. I've talked about freeholds and leaseholds before, or primarily freeholds, fee simple absolute in possession. In the UK context, and indirectly here in Australia, fee simple absolute in possession there by grace of the Crown. It's not the superior interest, it's the highest interest that an individual can own. Or you could be a tenant, as I am currently here in Australia. Because I don't own a property, I don't own land. Interesting dimension, the ability to own a freehold interest or the superior interest is not a given. In all society, there's different situations in terms of ownership, and indeed in some socialist, communist societies, everything is leased from or on some arrangement from the state. So, here I am in Fiji in the melee of Alter and Nalter leases, which were expiring. Something I couldn't understand. One, there was no easy structure for the continuation of those leases, because my mindset when I first arrived is, so the leases are expiring, they've approved to put properties on, therefore the tenants, who were obviously in the Fiji context often Indo-Fijian farmers, they'd acquired a lease, they'd often been given approval by the managers, the Native Land Trust Board, the Itauke Land Trust Board, to build improvements. So built a house, often multi-generational families living in these farming properties, also involved both commercially for the sugarcane production, but also with other commercial businesses, because they didn't actually own land outright, and so they were productive in their activities. I'm simplifying things. So when I started to look at those leases, I discovered in many cases approval hadn't been granted for the building of the improvements for house on the land, but in other cases it was tacitly approved or acknowledged by the Native Land Trust Board in managing it. Use Native Land Trust Board because that's what it was at the time. What should have been a relatively straightforward process, which is leases are about to expire. As they're approaching expiration, we have a rent review. We either pay another premium to recognise the fact that you're taking over this now improved land. It's important because the requirement of the lease is where for production, so you took land that was hitherto unimproved, and for the first term, tenants had paid a proportion of unimproved capital value at a prescribed percentage for the duration of the lease. Got complicated. because there was a sense that there was just an agreed, relatively arbitrary range of values placed on land for their unimproved capital value. But of course, 60 years into a lease, as they were in Fiji, or 99 years, as they were in the UK, those properties, almost as a condition of the lease, or a prescribed condition of the lease in the UK's example, had been improved. They had improvements on them. In the UK, a house. In Fiji, a productive farm. It wasn't unimproved land anymore. And so it had been improved. And there were also physical improvements in the nature of a house. So my understanding of Westminster law, I couldn't get my head around why there wasn't just some sort of approach from the Native Land Trust Board to value the improvements, serve a schedule of dilapidation, schedule of repair, make sure that everything was in place, and renegotiate for a new lease. Coupled with this is the fact that those unimproved capital values were very small, and when you go into the historic distribution of rents on customary land within the ownership hierarchy that I've described in a previous episode on who owns customary land, that meant that the average customary landowner adjacent to a productive farm, living in their village in harmony, relatively alongside people using the land that was non-reserve land productively around them, was, I think we described it often in that situation as not receiving enough money to pay for a copy of the Fiji Times. So there was an anomaly. There was also discussion on whether there should be some element of turnover or overage included in a future rental situation. Anyway, it was a mess. Couldn't fully understand why it was a mess. And at the time, and I went a number of times on TV and talked about the situation with the NLTB, including in conversation a couple of times with the then general manager of the NLTB, about what I thought was a much bigger issue, which was the expiration of the residential leases, often for 75 years. And people had built very significant properties, and much of the non-freehold area of all the urban areas of Fiji, but I'm thinking here particularly of Suva, had been on customary land. And here we had people in quite expensive properties, and yet the customary land value was being calculated on a pre-prescribed percentage of unimproved capital value. But the land wasn't improved. When that was originally determined, when those building leases were granted, and these NLTB leases, I thought, had been influenced by British colonial rule and the Westminster system, and therefore would have been very similar to the Victorian leases I was used to back in the UK. When I looked at them, there was a very weird anomaly. And that's, some of them had been written that the land was owned by the customary landowners, because land is inalienable in its structure in the Fijian hierarchy. And the improvements, which I assumed would be returned in good and tenable repair to the landowners at the end of lease, were actually owned by the tenants, and they could transact them. The situation was much more compounded when we moved into the commercial sector, and particularly in the tourism sector, where leases were written so that at the end of a lease, the land belonged to the customary owners, the improvements belonged to a hotel chain. There was no provision of sinking fund in any of the structures, so there was And there wasn't even a commercially remunerative rate. It was more or less like a very small sinking fund amount that was paid to the customary landowners on a prescribed basis, although there were some overage agreements entered into in the tourism sector and turnover rent type of agreements to ensure a level of collaboration, but often not to the advantage of the customary landowners. Where in the world would the customary landowners or their managing agents, the Native Land Trust Board, who should have put in place a structure for an accumulation fund to buy out either the tenants at the end of the day, if that was the nature of a structure, and shouldn't have distributed all the rents in the first place, or they should have made it very clear in the leases that the improvements ultimately belonged to the customary landowners, and that a new lease could be granted or under an enfranchisement provision, but not to give a higher interest, always a leasehold interest. But that hadn't occurred. So we end up with what I would call perpetual leaseholds, a situation where land is leased for a long lease, granted to tenants, tenants own improvements. Landlords can never compensate tenants for the improvements to actually take back the land and the improvements. So you've sort of alienated by leasehold. As I said, there are problems. It's a train wreck. Worse still, Fiji being something of an exemplar to other Pacific island nations, this approach has been exported in many leases that I've read in Samoa, Vanuatu, and other countries, Solomon Islands. So I couldn't understand why we had this difference of what seemed like a structure, which wasn't without its problems at the end of a lease, but you just had to manage it more effectively in the UK. And with the UK's lessons, you should be able to learn that a long time before lease expiry, you should be talking to the tenants if they want to keep the land and improvements, and they can pay you a premium and stay on a low ground rent, or they can just pay you a higher ground rent because you've got improved land back, which is why you leased it in the first place. If you're getting my drift, this is quite frustrating for all parties, I think. And I didn't understand it until I was back in Australia in about 2008 or 9. I was asked to vet somebody else's exam paper in statutory valuation. And within the paper, which wasn't my subject, I wasn't teaching it, within the paper, there was a separation of land and improvements, and I couldn't get my head around it. But further digging brought to light that this all harked back to the fact that when the states of Australia were being established, there was what was seen as an optimum form of understanding and recording land ownership and land tenure and land registration, known as the Torrens system, put in place by Robert Torrens, now later Sir Robert Torrens. And that was he was in South Australia, and this was a form of registration recording of rights and interests in land that was adopted by all the other states. I'd been involved in a project for the Property Council, actually, on uniform Torrens title, because none of that Torrens is in any way, shape or form uniform. Each state has its own structure. And the story here takes us into the shipwreck story. So this is where it gets interesting, I think, historically. At that time, the registrar, for want of a better word, of lands in New South Wales was Christopher Rolleston. Well, he was dispatched by the then Governor-General to go and meet Torrens. So we're going back to the 1870s, 1880s, again, Victorian era, around the time that Fiji was ceded to Queen Victoria, 1874. And Rolleston went to learn from Torrens how best to deal with these systems. He then returned to New South Wales, and in those days you couldn't easily traverse the country by car or train, because they hadn't, the roads weren't there and the trains went in, and it was pretty significant distances cross country, so he sailed. Now, ultimately, I believe, and this is the story I have been advisedly told, Rolleston's boat was shipwrecked. He and his colleagues were okay. They managed to get to shore, and eventually, I don't know where it was where it's actually shipwrecked, but they managed to make their way back ultimately to Sydney, where he reported to the Governor-General. He said, "Rolleston, you're late. Where have you been?" I was like, "Oh," he said, "we got shipwrecked. Lost all my notes." He said, "Well, yeah, what did you learn?" He said, "Well, no, my notes are lost." And so the story goes. The Governor-General said, "For goodness sake, you just spent time with this person. Wing it, man. Come up with a solution." And he did. And this solution is where, when leases and structures were being drawn out, there became a separation between land and improvements. So you might know that at that time, Fiji was a protectorate of New South Wales. So what happened in New South Wales in Australia, and we're talking about pre-federation here, so pre-1901, when the states joined together, the situation in New South Wales was transported to Fiji and other Pacific Island countries as protectorates of New South Wales. And so this confused system, not the original land and improvements thereon returning at end of lease expiration, but rather a situation where the improvements belonged to the tenants, was exported from Victorian New South Wales to Victorian Fiji, and then perpetuated through the years, even with the establishment of the Native Land Trust Board in the 1940s, into alter and alter leases, through the government leases as well. And we have ended up in a situation in Fiji where leases are, for want of a better word, not serving the best interests of the customary landowners. Now, this is important going forward, because leases can be redrafted at expiration in beneficial ways. But if people have got a clear ownership of their improvement, if they're in the urban areas, due to problematic drafting historically, one might argue that land has in part been alienated, because whilst the customary landowners may own it, they don't own what's on it. So this is very, very problematical. And as I say, this aberration, which has from a shipwreck become a train wreck historically as these leases are expiring, this aberration in leaseholds that we observe here in New South Wales, it's actually different in different parts of Australia. And I alluded to being part of a a Uniform Torrens title discussion. None of them are the same. Each state and territory has its own interpretation. And there's only really, to the best of my knowledge, South Australia, and because of its connection with Northern Territory, that have what is a sort of purer form of Torrens. All the others have been adapted as these are man-made or human-made constructs that have been adapted in other states, and I don't think fully appropriately. So when they work, leaseholds are a really good solution to enabling development to occur on land. When there's been a shipwreck causing a train wreck of understanding, for want of a better word, you've got a situation that sort of misses the point to a large degree occurring in Fiji and the Pacific. We run into a pretty major conundrum, because we can't easily redress what was agreed 99 or 75. A lot of the residential leases 75 years old in Fiji, and a lot of the Alta and Nulta, we're talking 60. So how do we redress that problem going forward? I think it's a case of being mindful about it, realizing that inadvertently those people who drafted the leases may have created something of a conundrum. There's a fascinating question that one could ask: if the native landowners collectively could take a class action against the people who were granting the leases, the Native Land Trust Board at the time, to redress their financial loss, which in essence you're going against your trust, which is there to serve you. But I don't know that it was the Native Land Trust Board's fault, because they had adopted an understanding of leaseholds from this confused variant from New South Wales. And so they were doing what they thought was right in writing up these leases. And I really think it's a huge issue for Pacific Island countries that have been, to a degree, misled. Can Fiji as a country sue the state of New South Wales as its protector? Does that then become Australia under the Federation for this mistake? I think that could keep lawyers busy for a very long time. So that is why we have something of a significant problem in regard to leases, and a difficult relationship and a mistrust of leases on the part of customary landowners in the Pacific. And I hadn't worked that out until a few years ago, but I think it may be of interest and may be worth sharing, and is easily addressed going forward in, for want of a better word, the ITLTB being NLTB 2.0, that going forward in Fiji and other Pacific Island countries, the optimum solution that allows for intergenerational equity on customary land can actually reflect that leases can really work as long as you put in good review structures. They can work for the customary landowners, the indigenous peoples, because it can potentially ensure intergenerational equity. It can work for tenants because it gives them access to land at a lower rental for a period to allow development. Thus, it's good for the government. But there was a reason we had sinking funds. And that reason we had sinking funds was specifically to enable that accumulation. So at the end of the leases, there would be a reflection on leaseholds that there was an accumulated fund to reflect the improvements. So I hope that's of interest. I do think leases have been confused and thus are a problem currently. But I also think leases are significantly part of a solution going forward to liberate access to customary land throughout the Pacific region, so that development can occur on land that isn't reserved land needed for the day-to-day use of a village community and for the indigenous community. But it can be made to work for the indigenous community, for tenants, and for the economic development of the countries. They just need drafting appropriately. So, that's it for today's episode, and as always, I will run into my big caveat. That caveat, of course, is the disclaimer, which is the views, insights and opinions shared on the Customary Land podcast of those of the host, today it was me, any guests and others they may cite. They don't constitute legal or financial advice and should not be construed as such by any individual, group or organisation. Before undertaking any dealing or action relating to customary land, individuals, groups or organisations should obtain professional advice from a qualified lawyer, experienced valuer and or certified accountant, chartered accountant, with specialised expertise in your particular country. Alternatively, you can contact Customary Land Solutions for advocacy, advisory and capacity building solutions for customary and indigenous landowning groups and trusts on land management, leasehold, as we've been talking about today, valuation and resource compensation issues. And you can contact Customary Land Solutions by email at contact@customarylandsolutions.com. Alternatively, you can contact me at contact@thecustomarylandpodcast.com. Until the next episode, stay safe, stay well, and thanks for listening.